Josh, you can start welcoming everybody.
Great. Thank you, Helen. And I should start recording at 5 o'clock as well, or is recording already?
Yeah. You can start recording it's already recording there.
Okay, great. What was our final tally?
173 signups.
Steve, you broke the record.
Now that usually means 30 people show up. So
well, we run this fun economic experiment, and we found that when it's free, we get about a 50% pull-through rate. And when people pay even 30 Rand, which is about $1.50, we get about a 92% pull-through rate. So
and you charge for this?
30 Rand, $1.75.
$1.50, really?
And it's not to keep the lights on. It's just because people come. Believe it or not, when people pay for something, they come. If you don't pay, they don't come.
That's a great blog post, by the way. I don't know if you guys have a website. I would do this as your inaugural post, as marketing lessons one. Seriously.
I'm a behavioral economics major. Like, I love this stuff. I also like testing the different price points. Like, how low can you go to get people to come through?
Well, I think a real A/B test though is if you would have me on 5 times and we did different price points, right? So you have to control for the speaker. Right?
Oh, if you're offering it up, Steve, we can do a whole speaker series, a whole series of fireside chats.
Listen, I seriously. South Africa is on my bucket list. If you're ever interested in figuring out how to get some groups of folks, government, other universities, etc., kind of to organize a tour. I've done this previously, where somebody sponsors me and just comes out, and
that'd be awesome.
And my wife and I then make a vacation out of it. So I'm not giving you homework, but if there's ever any interest, we've done this.
We would love it. Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful place. I mean, I've lived in 5 or 6 different African countries, traveled around to a lot of them, and this one, it's California, but bigger, more expansive, more affordable.
We've been to Tanzania, but that's about it.
Okay, cool. Very different than TZ. Both wonderful.
The classic, safari with the kids thing.
Flying to Kili, go over to Ngorongoro. Tarangire. Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah.
And say we've been to Africa. I mean, that's
I mean, it's South Africa. It's also a very nice lead-in, and I honestly, like, the Western Cape really is so comparable to California. But it's, if you took SF, LA, Sonoma, Big Sur, Yosemite, and then put them all like in a small microcosm, they're only an hour from one another. And then you also took, say, Zion Arches, put that about an hour away. It's all just like very compact in this little area. But the mountains are 1,000 meters high. The beaches are 6 kilometers long. Like, it's big. It's African big. Wonderful place for sure. So we'll have to talk about that. We'd love to have you down here.
Maybe I could get another ranch. Because this one's kind of used.
So it looks like we have, I think, 52 people dialing in now. Yeah. So let's maybe give it 3 more minutes and see who pulls through. Where is your ranch now?
Well, if you remember the area, remember where Half Moon Bay is in Santa Cruz?
Oh, yeah, of course. Definitely.
So equidistant from each other on the coast is a park called Ana Nuevo State Park. So I bought part of the park in the last internet bubble.
Oh, man. That's great.
So I have both sides of the highway.
So there's west of the Santa Cruz Mountains there?
Oh, yeah. So it's, from the ocean to the mountain.
Wow, incredible. Yeah, you can't go wrong there. No, definitely.
Well, until the wildfires came, and then we were standing there with hoses fighting the fire.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
I don't know if the news gets, but Santa Cruz Mountains, 1,000 people lost their houses. 1,000.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's incredible. I wouldn't expect that too. I mean, obviously it's a super wet area too. I know this is the end of the summer and all, but I mean, those mountains are generally pretty wet and arid or humid.
But they have this, it's the classic, this area hasn't burned since white people lived here.
So it's due for one of them.
So it's the classic, you don't want to do prescribed burns. And that we had a lightning storm that was a once in a lifetime storm. So just on the peninsula, a couple of 1,000 lightning bolts hit the ground.
Wow.
And so these created a series of fires that coalesced in multiple parts of California. This one in the Santa Cruz Mountains burned 86,000 acres.
And
but
the wind
others
kicks up.
around others around the state, there were multiple fires of hundreds of thousands of acres. So,
wow.
All right, whenever.
We have 80 people on now. And I believe, Helen, I'm just going to make sure you can hear us all right, and we're good to start.
Yes, all good. Welcome
Great.
to start.
Awesome.
All right.
Oh, welcome everyone. Josh Romisher, CEO of Stellenbosch University LaunchLab, and in our fireside discussion, maybe a terrible pun intended there, Steve and I talking about the wildfires that are going on in California, and actually here in Stellenbosch today. We could probably use a little bit of a fireplace as well to keep warm in the rain. But I just want to really thank Steve for joining us today. We have an hour with Steve. Real quick before we get into his background, we get into the Q&A, I just want to give an update on the Stellenbosch University LaunchLab. It's been an incredibly exciting time for us, and I really believe that now September is the moment where we're really interacting with campus and with the local ecosystem even more. We have taken really adversity in the pandemic as opportunity to rebuild our brand, to rebuild our logo, to really rebuild our programs. And we're very much looking forward to working with all of you. And for the first time tonight, I'm going to preview very quickly our new brand. This is now the new logo for Stellenbosch University LaunchLab. You'll notice that there's a very close affiliation with the university as we work much closer across different faculties and with everyone here. And then as of this week, and special thanks to our team, we're going to have our new website going live. So by Friday, we hope to have this live with all of our new programs. And you'll also see here the Entrepreneurship Hub. And so for everyone involved within the university or the local ecosystem, we've heard that we need a single place to go for all the things that are happening on and around campus and the local ecosystem. And we're happy to house that on our website so everyone can go to that single source of truth and really start their entrepreneurial journey or figure out where on that journey they are. And so it's a good lead in to today's discussion. We have 4 buckets that we really focus on at LaunchLab. That's inspire, build, grow, and support. And we really want to help people that want to try to be entrepreneurial. They want to start the journey, but don't know where to begin. And so today, this conversation with Steve is a perfect example of inspire. We're really hoping to bring incredible speakers with a great deal of experience and expertise to all of you. So you can ask questions, you can learn, you can really hear more about an experience and an overall entrepreneurial journey from others that will hopefully inform your own. And so I feel very, very fortunate to have Steve here today. So Steve's background is he's an entrepreneur turned educator. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about that. But Steve came to Silicon Valley, I think in 1964 or so, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, the dinosaurs roamed the earth then, but in the mid-70s. So give me at least another decade.
All right, I was off by a couple. I was giving you the earlier side of it, but in the mid-70s, as I've heard from a couple of your podcasts, Silicon Valley was still very, very different than what it looks like today. So going to be really great to talk to Steve about how that whole ecosystem grew, because we really are trying to build an ecosystem here in the Western Cape and across South Africa. So Steve is considered one of the fathers of modern entrepreneurism. He's credited with building launching the lean startup methodology. And I can personally say that it's taken me a number of years to figure out how impactful that really is. After starting 7 different companies myself, Steve's methodology is pure genius. And this is only through experience and through I'm sure a lot of trial, error, and success as well. He's the author of 4 Steps to the Epiphany. It's a great book. The Startup Owner's Manual. And then you can also go on steveblank.com, which is his blog. Tons of different articles, great research, and great different articles there. Steve teaches at Stanford, where I met him a couple times and where we were able to pull these resources and have him come to talk to us today. Columbia, Berkeley, NYU. And I think, Steve, it's really interesting because you've been somewhere in that nexus of entrepreneurism. You were also in the military, and you do a lot with figuring out how to bring innovation to the military and vice versa. And that is something that a lot of us forget, that Silicon Valley and a lot of the innovations that we use today came from military R&D and some of the great technology that's come out of that. So yeah, thanks so much for being here today, Steve. For everyone on the call, we're going to go for about half an hour of Q&A and a little bit of fireside chat. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A button. If you have a question that you'd like to put forth to Steve, please put your question in that little box. We'll curate a couple questions and hopefully have 15, 20 minutes at the end to go through some of those with Steve. So Steve, if it's cool by you, I'm going to kick it off by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became an entrepreneur.
Well, Josh, thanks for having me. That by itself could take an hour, so kick me when I start to babble. But as you mentioned, I've had a couple careers. The first one is in the military. Spent 4 years in the U.S. Air Force during Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and then I came out to Silicon Valley in the semiconductor boom. That is when we were making chips and actually had fabrication plants in the valley itself. And the short version is I did 8 startups in 21 years. 4 of them as part of the founding team, eventually CEO of them. And then in the last, what was called bubble, the internet bubble, I got lucky enough that my company was incredibly overvalued, but was smart enough to take the money off the table and go home to see my kids grow up, which we'll talk about later. Most entrepreneurs kind of forget about that part. And then at loose ends, started thinking about the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship. And as you mentioned, did something that most entrepreneurs don't do, is actually look back and thought about how startups were built and what people told us was what we were supposed to do, and actually came up with a different methodology that is a different way to build startups than the common wisdom was, and ended up teaching in a couple of universities. And I think of Stanford as my home, and Columbia University in New York is where I kind of go a couple times a year to kind of teach some classes. So that's my background. As you said, I work with not only entrepreneurs but large companies, and to me the biggest challenge is to help governments figure out how to innovate, because they're being as disrupted as much or more than even companies. And while we could afford to have a retail chain go out of business, it's kind of a bit more impactful and probably more harmful when a government agency providing services for your country goes out of business. So that's what I've been doing, and I do this is I kind of talk to folks and share with them what I've been thinking, some of which might actually be right, and most of which you'll have to figure out yourself.
And Steve, one of the things I love, I was listening to an interview with you recently, and I think for a lot of people, you have to really think about startups differently. And you made a comment that a startup isn't a mini company. That's not the way to think of this. And you have this quote that you define a startup as a temporary organization designed to search for a scalable and repeatable business model. And I think that's just so key to how a startup works. Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about how a startup is different than a big company, and maybe just get a bit deeper in that definition and how you came about to that terminology for a startup?
Yeah, that was I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out complicated things that I could explain to myself, because I always kind of run into these things that people take for granted as, oh, he's in a startup or she's in a startup. And I go, well, what exactly are we supposed to be doing? Is it a place to bring our dogs and get free food for lunch, or is it to be small forever and have a band of tight folks working together, or do we have some other goal? And before I answer your specific question, there was even a bigger question I ran into is, who's an entrepreneur and what is a startup? And it turns out, and I'm going to give you a US-centric definition that you could see whether it applies to South Africa as well. So it turns out, and I found this out in a very funny way, is when I started teaching, I said, well, I know what an entrepreneur and a startup is. I did this for 21 years. It's people like me. You have a crazy idea. You try to raise $10 million, and you shoot for the moon. You need to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue in the next 5 years. How hard is that? And luckily, the head of the department was smart enough that said, well, why don't you sit in this other class? And someone else was teaching entrepreneurs, but they were small business entrepreneurs. And my head exploded. I went like, well, wait a minute. They don't want to, have $100 million of revenue. They're trying to figure out how to feed their family. And what I realized, and this is slightly, I'll circle back to your question, that there really needs to be a taxonomy, that is kind of a model that says, oh, there are different types of entrepreneurs in every country. And we use the same word to describe entrepreneurship and innovation, but the people are different, the goals are different, the amount of capital you need to do different. And so let me give you a set of examples, at least in the States. So the first type of entrepreneur I call a lifestyle entrepreneur. I live by the ocean. I have friends who love to surf. California, and particularly where we live, is a kind of surfing nirvana, much like parts of South Africa. But they have to, figure out how to make money to live. So they have a little surf shop, and it basically says, with a sign on the door, surfing lessons 9 o'clock to 10:15. And they figured out that that's all they need to do to pay for, food and lodging and utilities. But you know what? They are entrepreneurs. They have figured out that, they don't work for anybody else. They had an idea of a business model, and they are pursuing it. But if you think about it, they don't want anybody else to work for them, and they're not interested in scaling their business, and that is entrepreneurship. The next step up, in the US, 99.8% of all corporations in the US are what we call small businesses. And a small business is someone who's trying to feed their family or an extended family. And a small business could be somebody who's opening up a restaurant, or it could be a web design consulting business, or any other business we kind of take for granted. They are entrepreneurs. You're not working for anybody else. You're putting your time and money at risk, but the type of people you could hire are kind of limited by, their goals and the amount of capital you have, and is typically, friends, family, cousins, and then maybe, extended community. People are not flying in from across the world to join your, web development company or join your restaurant. And the goals you have limit where you could get capital. And this is a big idea. If you're doing a small business, trying to raise venture capital is what I call an impedance mismatch, meaning the people who want to put money at play at risk capital scale, meaning they want to be venture investors or angel investors, are not interested typically about people who are willing to make, a small amount of money per week. So number one, it's kind of important to understand that distinction between the business you're building and the amount of capital and where you could raise capital. The next type of innovators and entrepreneurs are what I call scalable startups. And scalable startups are what Silicon Valley does. Scalable startups shoot for the moon. And there are a couple of interesting characteristics. Because they shoot for the moon, they could attract capital that's called, in the general sense, risk capital, which means venture capital, angel investors, etc. People who are putting money into companies believing that they'll invest in 10, 6 will die, 2 will be okay, but 2 will give you 10x return that might pay for their entire other investments plus a multiple on top of that. It also means that these types of companies can attract people, are magnets for people coming from all over the world. And so now all of a sudden, scalable startups are run by entrepreneurs, but with different vision, different risk profiles, by the way. If you're a small business, your risk profile for failure, if you're feeding your family or extended family, it's pretty low. Because if you go out of business, people are going hungry, or you might lose your house or something else. If you're an entrepreneur going for a scalable startup, you're willing to shoot for the moon because you realize something interesting, at least in innovation clusters. The word for a failed entrepreneur is actually called experienced rather than failed. That's a critical distinction about the ability to take risk. And finally, there's 2 more, and I'll be done, and then I'll finally answer your question. There are corporate entrepreneurs, people who inside of large corporations or government agencies who see something that needs to be changed and wants to do something that isn't part of the existing business model, and basically act like scalable startups, or try to, inside of corporate structures. And believe it or not, it's harder to do innovation entrepreneurship in a large organization than it is outside. And that's counterintuitive. You would think large companies have all these resources, but large corporations are designed to execute a known business model. That is, they got large because they figured out who their customers are and what products to deliver, et cetera. And here you are inside trying to do something radically different. It's sometimes quite difficult. And then finally, the last type of entrepreneur are people who want to do social entrepreneurship. That is, where profit is no longer the name of the game. You're thinking about other metrics. And so that also changes your business model, also changes who you could attract as investors and the type of people who want to work there. So with that, we now have a taxonomy, and for South Africa and for also your incubator, I think it's pretty important to kind of differentiate about, well, we're all entrepreneurs, we're all passionate, but what is it we want to build, and how come they could raise lots of money and I can't? And how come people are like flying in from Europe and other places to join their folks, and I can't even get people from across town to join mine? So it's kind of nice to have that in mind. And then we can answer your question about like my definition of a startup. And that basically was applied to scalable startups, but I think, other forms could think about it. Number one is the goal of a startup, and here was the big insight, is not to stay a startup. That's a big idea. That's why a startup is a temporary organization. This whole notion of being small and it's exciting and it's what people, write about, gee, we were eating ramen for the last 2 years and blah, blah, blah. The goal of a startup is eventually to be a large company, not a startup. So a startup is a temporary organization. The next part of that definition, designed to search. And this was basically the core of my work. Large companies, as I mentioned, execute known business models. And by a business model, as I said, is we know who our customers are, we know what products they want, we know who our competitors are. But in startups, you're actually searching for trying to figure that out. And what that means is on day one, even though you believe you're a visionary, the data says that most of you are actually hallucinating. So what we're actually trying to do is turn those beliefs into facts as rapidly as possible by using a process, this customer development process and the lean methodology, to search for something. And what we're searching for is a repeatable and scalable business model. And again, that fancy word of business model was just all those pieces that make up a successful company. Who are the customers? How do you price it? Competitors? What's product market fit? How do we keep and grow customers? You might have opinions about that on day one, and you might start thinking, oh, we need to hire all these people to do this, but the odds are you're probably wrong. And so how do you quickly turn what's essentially a faith-based organization on day one, a religious activity, into facts as quickly as possible? So you asked the world's shortest question, and I gave you the world's longest answer, Josh. So you better be careful about the next question you ask.
It's incredibly helpful, Steve. And I think for a lot of people, it's you look at entrepreneurs and you look at startups, and it's just this big ball, and no one knows. It's very ambiguous what all these things are. So breaking out that taxonomy is actually incredibly helpful. I can say personally, my second startup was more of an SME that I thought was a scalable business. And therefore I put the wrong type of input into it. I attracted the wrong type of capital, and it didn't work. It was actually my most failed startup because I was trying to build one thing, but I was actually building something else. So
right.
In that whole idea of inspiring, I think a lot about inspiration is about breaking apart these pieces and saying, it's great if you want to build the surf company. That's cool. Just understand that you're not going to attract venture capital at 100x return for most likely building the company that teaches you how to surf from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. So just understand, I think, where in that taxonomy you fit, and that will help you understand the types of employees you attract, the type of business model you build, the type of capital you're looking for. You hit on something there that I think is incredibly important. It's this idea of searching. So especially with a startup, you are searching for a business model. You don't have the business plan, which we talk a lot about, the fact that the old school model is to just, here's your business plan, fill it in, You talk about there's an Excel button that puts the 100 million by year 5 in there, and that's good to go. And you bring your business plan to the bank, and that's what it is. But this idea of searching for a business plan, I think really feeds into your lean startup methodology. So business model canvas, customer discovery. So maybe could you just talk to us a little bit about how you search? If you know that there's a problem or a challenge you want to solve, how do you apply lean startup to search for that business model?
Yeah, so this is the thing that messed me up for 20 years. And it's, you know, one of the nice things about teaching entrepreneurship is having screwed it up every possible way. It was actually quite fun to kind of deconstruct it and figure out, well, how could have I, much like your story about, you know, only in hindsight do you realize X and Y. So one of the first mistakes I make, and I see a lot of entrepreneurs making it, is one of the great things about being an entrepreneur is the passion and the vision you bring to want to do X. And X could be anything. I want to solve this problem, or I want to build X and Y. And that's what's great about entrepreneurs. But it's also kind of the death trap, is because the minute you say, I want to do X or Y, at least for me and most of the folks I see, is your next step is, well, let's go build it. You know, let's go raise money and let's get people and let's put together a team and we're going to build this thing and we're going to ship it. And the only problem we're going to have is, do we have a big enough building to put all the bags of money that are coming? And it turns out most of the time you were wrong. You were wrong about the.
That's not how it works.
Yeah. Well, not only don't you get the bags of money, but fundamentally you were the real problem is you were wrong about what people wanted to buy, because while you believed, and by the way, it wasn't that you built the wrong thing. That's the first thing you would say is, oh, I built the wrong thing. Actually, the first problem was you thought you understood the problem you were solving. It's a big idea. And so the first step for me in this whole lean methodology, which is just a fancy collection of a set of piece parts I'll describe in a second. But the first part is, why don't you write down what problem you think you're solving and for who? Just write that down. Oh, not what you're building. Oh, we're building product X. That's great. But who's it for? And why do you think people want to buy it? Great, write that down. And by the way, and this is great at Stanford because, you know, much like at your university, people think they're the smartest people on the planet and all they have to do is write stuff down and build it and it'll be done. I said, so humor me. Now that you wrote that down, why don't you get outside the building, leave your building, and find me 10 people who actually believe that's the problem, not the product. I don't want you to pitch it. I don't want you to demo it. I want you to leave all the slides at home and find me 10 people who have this problem that if you say you could solve this problem, they'll grab it out of your hands. And of course, a week later, they come back and go, well, not exactly. So step one is you want to validate that the problem you're trying to solve is actually a problem other people have. And then if you're lucky enough and people say, well, yes, that is a problem, then in fact, you could start asking, well, how do you solve it today? Not, would you like my solution? How do you solve it today? Boy, then you've now learned, well, we kind of like couple together these piece parts from other things to try to solve it. Well, if they do that, then you know it's an important problem. But if they say, well, it's really not that important, so we just kind of let it go, then I'd be worrying about whether you're solving a high value problem. And then finally, if they do say, oh, we put together all these piece parts because it's a really important problem, you could say, what if we could solve it this way? Still not showing them your solution, but just as a thought experiment. And they'd say, boy, if somebody actually had something like that, we'd grab it out of their hand. Boom. Then you get to show them your potential product in PowerPoint or something else. And now you've done two things. You validated the problem, you validated the solution, and then it allows you to do a formal process of the lean methodology, which, by the way, has three parts. And we just talked about one of them implicitly, which is getting out of the building. Because a key part of the whole insight of being a successful entrepreneur is the following. There are no facts inside the building, so get the hell outside. And I can't tell you how tough that is for entrepreneurs. Because there really is an inverse problem here. The smarter you are, the harder it is for you to do that. That is, If you're really smart, you've spent your life thinking you could pre-compute the answer to most tough questions. The problem is that entrepreneurship is kind of an NP-complete problem, which is a fancy word for saying it's kind of computationally unsolvable. You can't compute the answer sitting inside the building. And so the facts are literally out there. Who are the customers? Well, you can have an opinion inside the building, but until you get out and start talking to them, that is, all these opinions and assumptions you have, great, I want you to have them because I call them hypotheses. And by the way, I use that fancy word inside Stanford because they pay a lot of money, as you know, every year to go to school. But outside Stanford, it means you're just effing guessing. So I want you to write down all your guesses. And now we're going to get outside the building and start testing whether those guesses are true. And that's the first step of the lean startup methodology. It's called customer discovery. Let's take all our guesses or assumptions, write them down, and we're going to use kind of a single piece of paper to organize those guesses called the business model canvas. And the business model canvas is something developed by a guy named Alexander Osterwalder. It basically says every new venture needs to worry about 9 things. And actually, you need to worry about 1 million things. But let's put down the 9 things that really matter. Who are your customers? Great, let's write down, before you leave the building, who do you think they are? And I don't mean their names. I mean, are they, urban youth? Are they in the countryside? Are they women 25 to, 45? Are they poor? Are they rich? Do they, what apps do they, whatever you think their demographics and psychographics are, write that down because we're going to test that. And then number 2, the most important thing, along with who they are, is, so what problems do they want solved? You've just kind of tested that. And how does that translate to the features that you're going to build? By the way, these first 2 things have a special name. This match between customers and what you're building is called product market fit. And that fit between customer and product typically is the first thing you're getting out of the building to figure out. Is, can you find people who actually want to grab out of your hands the right features you're building? And almost always, you get the customers wrong and you get the features wrong. But if you do this quickly, you can quickly hone in to what we call product market fit. And at the same time, you're testing the 7 other things on this canvas. You're testing, what's the right distribution channel? Is it an app on the Google Play Store or the Apple Store? Or is it a retail venture? Or are you selling through others, through an indirect channel? How are you going to keep and grow customers? That is, what's your customer acquisition strategy? Is it just on the web, or is it something else, or is it Google AdWords? What's your revenue model? Not your price, but what's the model? Is it a subscription, freemium, direct sales, something else? And then what's the pricing tactics? Then you're going to be thinking about what types of resources do you need? That is, what do you need to be expert at? What type of activities do you need to do? What are the costs, and are there any partners? And you'll get out of the building, and after you find product market fit, you'll be testing all these other assumptions. And the last piece of lean, so the first part was customer development out of the building. Second part was using this business model canvas to kind of put all these assumptions together. And the third part was something kind of neat, is that nowadays we could build what are called minimum viable products, or MVPs. And MVPs said, you don't need to finish the product to get feedback. In fact, you could build a wireframe or a PowerPoint slide or a dummy price list or a cardboard mock-up. And what you want to do is get the most learning at any point in time of where you are in the company by getting feedback on this, by showing it to customers or potential customers. And we use Agile Engineering to do that. In the old days, we would specify the product, we'd lock engineers in the room, we'd throw them, caffeine and sugar, and like a year later, we get a product and try to sell it. And that was called waterfall engineering. That is, you went a step at a time. Nowadays, we realized we could build hardware and software incrementally and iteratively with this methodology called Agile. And so the third part of lean is Agile Engineering, building MVPs. And that creates something powerful. What it allows us to do is say that we're wrong and change our mind. And that allows us to do something called a pivot. And a pivot says, when we get enough data from anybody, whether about the product or about the customers, etc., we're allowed to change our mind without firing somebody. And that's kind of a big idea. In the old days, if no one was buying, we'd fire the VP of sales. Or first we'd fire the VP of marketing, then we'd fire the VP of sales, because we already shipped the product and it's not selling. Now we could move that learning much earlier and say, we don't need to fire anybody. The only thing we need to fire are our customers or our product or our pricing. And so a pivot allows us to be fast and agile as we're starting our company. So Josh, what was your question?
I don't remember anymore, but that was awesome.
I don't remember either.
That was,
you just got the semester lecture.
It's fine. We'll send out this recording afterwards, and I would definitely tell everybody to listen to those last 15 minutes about 20 times. Because Steve, how many years into your entrepreneurial journey did you start to figure all that out? I mean, that is
20.
Yeah. So you just got 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears in about 15 minutes decompressed right there. And it is really very different than how people think about building businesses and how things were built in the past. And Steve, maybe there's a question for you here too, because we have a lot of people on this call who are incredibly smart engineers, incredibly smart chemists or data scientists who probably would love to sit behind a computer and write code, or sit behind a lab desk and build something, but getting out of the building is really hard. And so something that we do a lot at LaunchLab is try to effectively force people out of the building, but give you the tools to do so. So I'm curious if you could offer any insights for people in terms of either entrepreneurial mindset or just tips. Like, what is, if you're scared to death to put something in a human's hands and get out of the building, how do you take that first step?
Well, I remember taking the first step. Actually, my first step was actually learning how to cold call people. That is, not even getting out of the building, but picking up a phone back in the day. Believe it or not, there was a day before email, and trying to get hold of people. And I remember physically the rush of joy when somebody not only said, "Oh yeah, that sounds interesting. Why don't you come by?" It's like, whoa, is that what it took? You know, the old aphorism, a journey, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. I think just getting out and maybe practicing with some friends and practicing, on campus or practicing with a relative, and writing up a script, of like, what should I ask? Because you'll pretty soon throw out the script. When I teach this for the U.S. National Science Foundation, when I teach scientists and engineers, most of them are introverts. In fact, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert for those folks are whether they're looking at their shoes or my shoes, at least when they start. And eventually we teach them how to make eye contact. And we do that. Actually, I used to do that when I hired a ton of engineers in my companies inside of sales and marketing. I'd teach them how to emulate empathy. They actually didn't have to have any, but they had to go into emulation mode. And because most of them were so smart, they had extra cycles here that they could actually emulate what some, great people. It turns out if you go to business school, you typically have some extra empathy. And if you're a scientist and engineer, it's a lot harder. But you can emulate it, and by emulate it, I mean just kind of fake it. It's faking that you care or faking that you really want to connect with people until it actually becomes second nature. And the goal simply is you've got to convince yourself that if you don't do this, the odds of success have gone down by at least an order of magnitude. So maybe to go the high order bit, if you just sit in your building and don't do customer discovery, your odds of failure have gone up 10x. How about that? I think the data is now in that says that's probably close to being the truth. And that customer discovery, as you implicitly pointed out, is probably the easiest technical thing to do, but it's the hardest emotional thing to do. First of all, no one wants to hear that their baby's ugly. In fact, when you go out the first time, when someone says that, you turn it the other way to make sure you weren't showing them the wrong end. And by the way, it's also the reason why you can't outsource this. That is, if you outsource customer discovery to, let's say, a VP of sales or one of your other employees that are not a founder, they'll come back and tell you, oh, people said, no, they won't buy it. Your first reaction is, well, you're not describing it correctly, or you're not selling it correctly. And after 3 or 4 times, you'll fire them. Well, now change the game, and I'll force you to get out and hear that same data directly. And the first couple of times, cognitive dissonance will set in. I mean, smoke will come out of your ears because you can't believe people don't see what you see or whatever. And then finally, and here's the big idea, why founders have to do this, because you're the founder. If you're doing this well, you'll say, well, how about if we had this other feature? And people are, oh, why didn't you say that? Well, I'd buy it then. Well, you don't even have that feature, but you're the founder. Big idea. You could go back and convince your other co-founders that that feature is, but if you're an employee, there's no possible way you could come back and say we need feature X or Y, because people will say you're just adding stuff to the pile. But if you're a founder, you could be listening probably more carefully than anybody. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. I think one thing you touched on there too, we're seeing it a lot through the pandemic, is that ability to pivot. So the ability to pivot means hopefully you're keeping your fixed costs low, your maybe variable cost, you're keeping your team small. How do you think about team size and hiring in front of testing these hypotheses? Like how do you, there's almost a chicken and the egg problem there. So I'm just curious how you build the ability to pivot in while you're still trying to get product market fit.
Yeah, so, one of the things that at least in the US, and I have to admit I'm ignorant about the South African entrepreneurial community, but at least until the pandemic and maybe still going on now, we were flooded with capital. That is, there was just a ton of risk capital, which again, I keep using that word to kind of mean angel and venture capital and pre-seed and seed and whatever, which in fact is much different than when I was an entrepreneur. So it covers up, infinite capital covers up infinite mistakes. So even if you didn't pivot, you could just hire more people and do that. So and I say that because I want to just differentiate your question from, do you have a lot of money, or do you have, are you resource poor in terms of capital and other things? If you're resource poor, then you really want to get this product market fit thing right. And a pivot allows you to kind of keep doing it until people are starting to grab the product out of your hand. And by the way, for a piece of enterprise software, that's maybe, $500,000 deals, but, getting five purchases on the web is no data at all. So then maybe that number is 5,000. So I just want to give you the scale. But if you have a lot of capital, that kind of, the level of precision, is kind of a little looser. Did I answer your question, Josh?
Yeah, it helps a lot. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting to draw between Silicon Valley and Africa in general, is that Silicon Valley has historically had a dearth of capital. So you're right, companies can be unprofitable for a long time. They can pivot in Series D. They can be figuring things out for a long time. In Africa, the capital is more scarce, and the valley of death happens a lot earlier. And so I think for entrepreneurs on the call, this ability to test in a small way, but test rapidly early is really important. Don't assume that you can pivot after Series B or whatever it may be, because the capital might not be there to hide some of the deficiencies in the model. So it's even, I think, more important in Africa to test early, to use the lean startup methodology, to really think about your customers, to get out of the building. It's even more imperative here because there's not a lot of capital to cover up mistakes.
Completely agree. Though I just want to give a warning to everybody. The word pivot is not an excuse for attention deficit disorder. What that means is, you don't run back inside your building if you're a founder after one customer said you need X feature, and then run into your engineering group and say, okay, we need to add that feature. I kind of have this rule with startups I coach is there's a 72-hour hold on your mouth, which says before you run in, you need to think about, for 72 hours, is this the most important thing you now want to go have the company do? And more importantly, have you heard it at least 3 other places? It's a big idea, because then it forces entrepreneurs to validate that insight that they think they had with, okay, there's a really interesting piece of data here. Is this signal in the noise, or is this noise? Or else you end up jerking around your development team with every good idea you had, Um, so pivot really says, do we have substantive data that says this is new path versus did we just hear something random? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's an incredible narrative too, because people always hold up, say, Steve Jobs, and they would say, well, he didn't care. Like, he told people what they wanted. He didn't go and listen to customers. I don't think that's true, but there is this idea that, do you listen to your customer, or do you build what you think the customer wants? And I think you're saying it's somewhere in between, or you need to really.
No, in fact, Josh, that's the classic great question. I mean, I get that all the time. And it took me actually a couple of years to figure out what later I realized Clayton Christensen had already figured out. And here's what it is. It turns out there are different types, besides that taxonomy of what type of entrepreneur you are, there are different types of startups. And I'll give you my three. There are ones that are entering an existing market. An existing market is, there are already competitors. There are already products. Customers could even tell you the name of the market. We're in the smartphone business. If you're making another smartphone, basically, this is the basis of competition. Tell me why yours is better. And so you can do discovery pretty easy, trying to understand what do people want done that the current product can't do, etc. That's what I call an existing market. But let's take the Elon Musk, market, where I'm doing Tesla or SpaceX or something that's just never been done before at scale. That's a new market. There are no customers. The market doesn't even have a name. Or if it has, it's, people consider what you're doing science fiction. This is a big idea. Asking people the same questions you did in an existing market in customer discovery and running the same types of minimum viable products is kind of insane, because, people are going to go, imagine this was like 1982. People wouldn't know what this black thing was. There's no way it could be a phone. What do I do with this? So you still want to do discovery, but the discovery you're doing is trying to understand what's the day in the life of the customer today, how is it going to be transformed, and what else around you needs to happen. Is it social change? Is there a technology ecosystem that needs to be built for your apps or system to work? Is there a government subsidy? Is there something that's different than just asking people, what feature do you like? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, no, it's great. And I think it's really interesting because there's this narrative, I think, out there that entrepreneurs go by instinct, they go by their gut, they're winging it. It's this, and what I'm hearing from you are all these taxonomies. So there are ways to break down how a startup works into the different types of startups, into the different markets you're entering, and even the process of. I think a lot of people would assume that there's not really a venture building methodology. And what I'm hearing here is there are techniques, there's methodology, there's ways to give yourself a higher probability of success if you understand how to break this ambiguous startup thing into its pieces. And I think that's, in this Inspire bucket, really important, because people that want to start the journey, they don't have the experience that you have to say, well, what kind of startup am I building? What kind of market am I entering? And then also, how do I start to build this company? So everything you've said here, I think, starts to demystify the narrative of entrepreneurism, to break it down into a bit of a scientific method and a bit of a taxonomy that you can get your head around.
And that was the intent, Josh, was to, what Lean really is kind of a sum of best practices that great entrepreneurs did instinctually. And so there are some people who are like instinctual great salespeople. There are some people who are great entrepreneurs, and they instinctively knew that this is the process that you did, but no one ever wrote it down. And so this is kind of, and surprisingly to me at least, it's now stood the test of time for 20 years. It seems to be, if not the method, a method that seems to be pretty successful in reducing early stage risk, reduces infant mortality of startups. So that's the process.
I could ask tons more questions. I'm going to go to the audience now, and thanks, Helen, for curating a couple of these. Our first question from David: if you were to rewrite your book, 4 Steps to the Epiphany, today, what would you write different, given everything you've learned since when you wrote it?
That's very funny. I never thought of that. That's a great question. I don't think I'd write a single thing different. Though most people read chapter 1 and 2, which is basically the first steps, customer discovery and customer validation. And I was actually writing the last couple of chapters to actually describe the entire life cycle about how a company scales. And while the words are different, Reid Hoffman actually executed chapters 4 and 5, which he called blitzscaling, about how to grow companies at scale. But no, I don't think, I think maybe different words that have now been adopted for those things, but unfortunately or fortunately, it's still a timeless book. Probably worth reading for those of you who are just getting introduced to entrepreneurship, because it just gives you a different mindset about how to look at business. No, I don't think
highly recommend that one, as well as Eric Ries's Lean Startup. And I think Eric was your student, right?
Yeah, Eric was one of the best students I ever had. And when he became the practitioner of Lean, we didn't even call it Lean, customer discovery then, the total market of customer discovery people doubled from me to him. So he was and I sat on his board and was his first investor in his company. So I got to watch him run these experiments, and yeah, he was genius.
Next question from Dale is based around the idea that the Agile Engineering, Lean Startup methodology needs that customer feedback and that quick customer cycle, which for maybe an app or something on the web is very easy. What if you have a more of an infrastructure business, or you have something with only a couple of big customers? And you talked about the governments earlier. Does that methodology still work for a project of that nature?
Yeah, I'll tell you the most extreme cases is one of the things I actually did say, and now I'll take it back. In the 4 steps of the Epiphany, I said, this will work for everything except for life sciences, for therapeutics and doing drugs, et cetera. Because my model was, it took a decade, and it was all lab based. It turns out that's fundamentally wrong. It even works for life sciences and infrastructure stuff, and here's why. What you're really testing is the entire business model. That is, while you might not be able to test whether the drug works, for another 10 years, you could be testing partnerships and, regulatory approval. You could be testing reimbursement from insurance companies. You could be testing, if you're building infrastructure, whether this thing is fundable, what are the government regs, what are the partnerships I could put together. So there's whole parts of the business model that are equally critical, in addition to building whether the product will work. In fact, just run the thought experiment. Assume the product, whether it's the infrastructure thing you're building or something else, assume we're 100% right. What else could screw us up from having a liquidity event, which means make a lot of money? Oh, well, there are all these other things. Well, why don't we test those? Oh, does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a great point too, to think that this lean methodology or design thinking, whatever you want to call it, isn't a one-time only deal, right? It's not like you go out and test the product and then you're done the lean adventure. You can use it for a number of different things all across the journey, I would think. So does lean also then apply to say companies that are a bit more mature? Do you see corporates employing lean at all?
Sure. Corporates struggle now in the 21st century with a whole set of issues they never had to deal with in the 20th, and that is disruption coming from all directions. And by disruption, and that's a fancy word for we're screwed in ways that we've never had to deal with before. In the 20th century, if you're a large company, your typical competitors were other large companies, and startups were considered as what we call the ankle biters. That is, they might have been down there on the ground, but to duke it out with you, that was like some fantasy. Well, now today, number one is startups are raising more money than large companies have for R&D. I mean, that's just a mind blower. Number two is obviously China as a major competitor and potential customer. All kinds of threats that if you went to business school more than 10 years ago, everything you learned other than accounting is obsolete. And I don't mean that anybody was being dumb or you're being dumb, but the whole world of business, even though, again, we use the same words, completely changed. Does that make sense?
No, very helpful. The next question from Lorna. Startups usually focus on product development, testing its viability and customer base. Building a brand is often a retrofit. Do you, or how do you embed a marketing strategy and brand building into your early go-to-market strategy or early strategy development?
Yeah, so I'm going to refer back to that business model canvas, the types of things to worry about. Alex, Alexander Osterwalder's version has a box called customer relationships. And he uses that to talk about the long-term relationships between customers and the company. I X that out. And that's the only thing that I changed for startups. For startups, I say that's the box where you're figuring out how to get, keep, and grow customers. And that's where branding is absolutely critical. Right? You're talking about customer acquisition. You're talking about, I mean, if you really think about what branding is, it's actually turning the resistance of or more importantly, the cost of customer acquisition down to zero in a perfect world. And if you think that's some fantasy, you know, Tesla spends $0 per car advertising. In the United States, Ford spends $1,500 per car advertising their high-end cars. That difference is branding. It's a big idea. Tesla gets $1,500 free on every car because they built a brand that people want to go to and grab, versus Ford, where they got to hit you over the head to kind of convince you with sexy models or you're going to be cool or whatever it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's great.
So I think of branding, in fact, the way everybody should think about branding is that it's a force multiplier on customer acquisition and retention. Big idea. You identify with the product and or the company. People buy an Apple iPhone, at least in the United States, not because it's a good phone. In fact, if you really would like put labels on a Samsung phone or LG phones and whatever, and call them, you know, iPhones, you know, bigger screens, bigger whatever, it's the brand. Why else would you be throwing out a perfectly good phone after a year or two to get the next version?
I have one more, maybe two more. This one's actually from the LaunchLab team. So we run a university-backed incubator. So we're tied in very closely with the university. We're really trying to promote entrepreneurism within the varsity and the student body. How do you meaningfully infuse the classes and students themselves with this appetite for entrepreneurism? How do you bring that passion for entrepreneurism to your student body?
Well, you know, I hate to build another taxonomy again, but this one's going to be pretty simple. It took me a while to realize this. Startups are built with two types of people, almost always. Not always, but almost always. You know, if you think about the beginning of Apple, it was Jobs and Wozniak. The beginning of Microsoft, it was Gates and Allen. If you look at Tesla, it was Musk and J.B. Straubel, who was actually the architect of the whole drivetrain. What that really tells you is something that people don't really think about much, is that great startups are built with a combination of innovators, that is the inventors, and entrepreneurs, who are the outside person who make those inventions look larger than life. And so most startup teams are the combination of those two. And some people think they're the innovator and the entrepreneur, and there might be corner cases where that's true. And the problem in universities and also national labs that I've run into is you have a great pool of genius scientists and engineers who are innovators, but not realizing to build a scalable company, you typically need to be partnered with a crazy person and an entrepreneur. For some reason, by the way, in life sciences, you often see the innovator and entrepreneur being the same person. I'd say there's a higher hit rate in therapeutics and the medical devices and diagnostics than in other areas. I don't know why, where that is the same person. But in most other areas, and again, think again about all the famous startups you know, there's usually a Mr. Outside who you read about in the press, etc. But then there's the co-founder who actually built the damn thing. So when you're inside of a university, the first thing you ought to look at it when you're building these entrepreneurial teams is, am I working with the innovator or am I working with the entrepreneur? And what's the right team that we could help form to have this thing scale? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'll mention today at least that this is all brought in collaboration with the USB, which is our business school, because I think we see a lot of the same. We have incredible technical experts, and I don't know if the business person is necessarily the crazy person. Those don't necessarily have to be the same thing, but the realization that you do need a team, right? Everyone can't be the CTO, everyone can't be the head of biz dev, everyone can't be the CEO. So I think it's important because a lot of early stage entrepreneurs think they have to do it all. And really, when do you bring in that scale? When can you bring in someone that does something better than yourself and therefore gives you that ability to scale? Very, very important. I think one last question, and then I'll definitely let Steve go because it's early for him and I'm sure he wants to enjoy his day. The parallels to the Bay Area in the Western Cape are pretty strong. So we have two incredible universities here with Stellenbosch and UCT. You have Berkeley and Stanford. The lifestyle, the weather, things are pretty similar. I do think obviously the Silicon Valley ecosystem has been going on for 50 or 75 years. It's pretty developed. As you've lived through a lot of that, you've been there since you said 1974. What have you seen have been the ecosystem developments? Like, what are the big step change things that really made that ecosystem go that we could potentially think about for bringing to the Western Cape here?
Yeah, so two things, and I'll try to be brief. One is the good news is the internet, my work, and other people have made the tools for entrepreneurship available everywhere. So entrepreneurs are available everywhere. And in most areas of the world, people have gotten smart, and there are almost for sure pre-seed or seed investors everywhere for angels here. But without risk capital at scale, it's like having one hand clapping. And by risk capital at scale, I think of entrepreneurial clusters as where are the places in the world you could raise $100 million for a new venture? And if it's not in South Africa, then you're missing a piece of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And it doesn't mean you give up, but it means you need to realize that unless you find that scale of capital to match that scale of entrepreneurship, what you're going to build are either small businesses, which might be a good goal, or that your great entrepreneurs are going to go get funding elsewhere, whether in Europe or US or China, and leave South Africa. And so one is to think about what Silicon Valley built by accident, and other people have duplicated on purpose, is an ecosystem that attracts both capital at scale and entrepreneurs at scale. The second thing is to think about these entrepreneurial clusters are not jobs programs for the local community. They create jobs, but you have a cluster that caught fire when they become magnets for people in your country and your region and the world. If you look at other entrepreneurial clusters, people fly there to live because there is that kind of confluence of all those things. The two other things I'll mention are kind of things about culture. One is that entrepreneurship thrives where a failed entrepreneur is actually thought of as experience, and I can't overemphasize this. If you have a culture where failure is thought of as, well, they're a failed business person, that is, someone created a large company is the same as someone failing at a startup, or gee, the bankers are coming at you, or you spend the next 7 years in bankruptcy court rather than it's a 2-week wind down process, then you don't have a system that actually supports innovation and entrepreneurship that doesn't understand the nature of risk and failure, both cultural and the bureaucracy. And then the last piece is something you can engineer very quickly. In fact, Josh, you could start it if it doesn't even exist. Maybe it does. And that's what I call the pay it forward culture. In Silicon Valley, there's this long history of people who've been successful helping others in the next generation without asking for anything. And I was surprised to find in other countries that you just have a meeting with an experienced people. In some countries, they have their hand out saying, well, what are you going to pay me to have this meeting? Or how much of your company are you going to give me if I connect you with X or Y? Even today, 50 years after, 75 years after Valley started, that culture of last generation of entrepreneurs helping the next one is fairly unique. But you could start it pretty easily if successful entrepreneurs or investors just would have coffees or open office hours in a public place, not in their office, but in a coffee shop that other people could see them. The peer pressure would actually get others to start doing that. And in fact, they would attract more and more better deals. Does that make sense? And so see if you could start a pay it forward culture in South Africa, or certainly around your university.
It's great, Steve. And I really want to thank you because you've done that today. I mean, you're definitely giving a lot of inspiration, a lot of insight. I'd really say to everyone here, go out and read Lean Startup, read the 4 Pillars of the Epiphany, steveblank.com blog. I mean, this is all incredible wisdom that you're handing down to all of us and really appreciate it. And it is a way to supercharge your business. There's definitely different taxonomies and methodologies that can give people a better probability of success. And we've heard a lot about them today. So really want to thank you for taking the time. Again, for everyone on the call today, please come and check out the new LaunchLab brand and website. We're really hoping to be able to inspire, build, grow, and support all of you on your entrepreneurial journey, and also give you a one single source of truth where you can go to find all the things that are happening in the community, so you really can get on that entrepreneurial journey, stay on it, and have some mentors and great guidance along the way. So Steve, maybe one in parting, any advice, any words of wisdom for all our entrepreneurs on the phone or on the call and in parting today?
Yeah. So for me, entrepreneurship, it's the worst job you could ever have in the world. Your co-founder is going to quit, your biggest customer is going to renege, and the toilets are stopped up, and you're the facilities person as well. It's a shitty job. But I have to tell you, it's the world's best calling. So if you're called, if you can't imagine doing anything else in the world, and you can't think about anything other than your company getting up in the shower in the morning and driving home, it's the best adventure you're ever going to have. But don't confuse it with a job. Founders are closer to artists than any other profession. You're not accountants, you're not whatever. You're creating something that never existed before. You see things and hear things that other people don't. And as I said, most of the time you're going to be hallucinating, but those times that you actually do see through that fog, you're going to create something that just never existed and change the world. So have a great journey.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks to USB as well for collaborating with us on this. And we're going to hopefully keep bringing great insights to everyone here. And thanks for joining. Steve, enjoy, have a beer at Half Moon Bay Brewery for us, and enjoy California.
Take care, guys.
Awesome. Have a great day, everyone.